Well, I want to welcome back our viewers to Conversations with John. This is a weekly opportunity to bring together leaders from across the denomination and invite them into conversation about what they're seeing in their world and how they experience it through their location. And I am thrilled to have with us a board member, longtime active representative for the wider church in the United Church of Christ, Elly Chong. Elly, welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself to our viewers and tell them a little bit more about who you are and where you are?
Okay, thank you. I'm Elly Chong, and I live in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is where I'm from right now. And I attend Central Union Church in Honolulu, and I am the daughter and sister of United Church of Christ ministers. So I was essentially born into the church.
I'm curious, I don't know if I've ever asked you this. When you go back to your childhood, since you were born and raised in the United Church of Christ, what are some of the memories you have that keep you so attached to this denomination? What did you experience early on?
Well, for me and for my family, I think the church was the center of all of our activity. And even though my father was the chaplain of a prep school founded by the predecessor of the Hawaii Conference, we attended Central Union, and very intentionally, because Central Union at that time, back in the late 1940s and 50s, was essentially an all-white church. And my parents felt it was important to help integrate the church. So we joined there and have been there ever since.
And I know you well. You have deep commitments to racial diversity and equity. And maybe I'm beginning to see some of the roots of that deep in your childhood with a family that was clearly committed to that.
Yes, and my father was always intentional about taking us to important events that he felt would later on be things that we could look back on. And I remember he took us to the annual meeting of the conference every year from the time we could walk. And I think that was really important because in the very beginning, they used to have separate groups speaking different languages.
Okay.
And eventually, they all spoke English. And so it was very interesting to see that happening because once when I was, later as I became an adult, they tried that again. They tried to have the conference break up into different languages. And I think that was always a very helpful thing for me to realize that people do speak in different tongues.
So you've known from the early days of your childhood a fairly rich and diverse culture and church in the Hawaii Conference, but you've also been active in the wider church. And when you come into the mainland, it's a predominantly white church. What has that been like for you? And has there been any adjustments that you've had to make as those sort of two different worlds collide with one another sometimes?
Well, I remember once when I was at a meeting of the executive council when we met in St. Louis.
Okay, my hometown.
I was met there by my aunt and uncle who happened to live there, and they ran a Chinese restaurant. And they took me to lunch at a department store, and it was the first time that I really experienced this kind of racial inequality, because we were told at first that, well, we're ending the lunch service. And then they said, but that's all right. So they led us to the very back of the bar rather than into the dining room. And, you know, of course, they took their time to take our orders and things. And I thought, you know, here are my aunt and uncle who work every day to serve food to people, and then they get treated this way. And ever since then, I've had a real feeling about what it's like to be discriminated against.
I'm so sorry. St. Louis is my hometown. I've often described it as the most racially divisive city in the country. It may not be true, but it's not far from the truth. And that was the world I grew up in, where racism was evident almost every day of my life. It took me a while to recognize it as that, but sometime I want to ask you about that restaurant. There's a good chance I ate sometime in your aunt and uncle's restaurant. So, but that's for another conversation. you've seen through the years a denomination, the United Church of Christ, committed to racial justice. And we're experiencing right now, in the midst of a global pandemic, also a national call for racial justice. I'm wondering what that looks and feels like from your location in Honolulu.
Well, I think if we examine who the essential workers were during the pandemic,
Yes.
the janitors, the healthcare workers, the grocery store workers, the people who were in the food establishments, by and large, these were either Black, Indigenous, or people of color.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that have lived with injustice their whole lives. And even here in Hawaii, we've seen that because we are so dependent on tourism that when all the hotels shut down, here we're with 228,000 unemployment claims being registered with the state. Here were the people that we don't think about. But then all of a sudden we realize that these are the people that have been keeping the economy going for all these years. For 50 years, we've been overly dependent on, say, the hotels and the airlines. And these are the people who have dealt with injustice their whole lives. And so I was really, my heart was really warmed when a few weeks ago, they had 10,000 people that gathered for a march in sympathy with George Floyd. And I thought this was really something to see that the new generation was taking it upon themselves to begin to do this, to really say that this was the perfect storm, that the killing of George Floyd brought everything into light. It brought the pandemic into light. It brought in the structural injustices that we have to light. And I think it's true everywhere.
And as you and I have talked about in previous conversations, the pandemic was really laying bare the systemic racism in that the 70% in communities with only about 30% of population people of color, 70% of the deaths were people of color. And in city after city after city, the death rates of people of color was 3, 4, and 5 times their population density. And so the pandemic was making very clear the impact and price that communities of color were paying in ways that certainly the white community was affected by it, but not at the same rate. And then on top of that, that brutal murder of George Floyd, and then Breonna Taylor, just one right after the other. After Ahmaud Arbery was also literally assassinated on the street by white men, all of that. And now here the country is erupting in a cry for justice, the likes of which I can remember the civil rights movement from my childhood, but it's a distant memory. So this is the first real collective call for justice that I've been able to participate in. And I'm wondering what your experience is as somebody who's been through this more than once, as you watch this unfold.
Well, I think that, yes, you talk about having been through it before. I think for many of us, it felt like in the beginning that we've been there and done that. But then I think on examining the situation, we realize that these are very, very different times, and that we're in the third week of the protest marches, and they're being run by millennial people and younger. And I have been very impressed with that, but it causes me to begin to have real empathy for what's going on, and to really re-examine what my ideals are and what do I have to leave behind.
Wow. So just real quickly, I too have noticed how young the leaders of this movement are. And it's too early to know, as somebody said to me last week, whether this is yet a movement or a moment. And as somebody who's seen this and who is now watching these young adults take to the streets and lead, do you suspect that this is a movement? Do you think it will sustain itself and that from this will come some of the lasting changes that we've been fighting for so long?
Well, first of all, I think that we have to admit that change often comes very slowly. And back in the time of the Civil Rights era and then the Vietnam War, we realized that even though we were speaking out against things, that it may take generations for the change to happen. But nonetheless, I think what we need, especially in the church, is to keep listening. We need to be supportive. We need to be aware. We need to be kind. And we need to keep learning. I think that that's the part that I appreciate in the United Church of Christ about the clergy, that the clergy are always trying to learn new things. And I think that that spreads to the congregation and to those of us who are believers, that we really have to keep learning. And I think that that's the key to everything, is that, for instance, in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, we were really talking about individual rights, like the right to vote and to be the right to do things. However, I think nowadays, I think what they're calling for is real systemic structural change that really changes how we see the world. Because I think we do have, I think color is part of our structure, and we need to examine that. That's the real challenge, that color frames everything we do. And I think that we need to begin to eliminate those built-in prejudices that all of us have, that we just sometimes don't even think about because it's just, we think it's part of who we are. And I think that the pandemic has really caused the church to do this, because the church now has to ask, how do we do church?
Right. And everything is different. Everything is on the table, and we're adapting.
When we go back to in-person worship, what are we going to leave behind? Because it's not going to be the same in-person worship. It's going to be very different.
One of the things that I sense might be changing, and you talked about, you were fighting for the right to vote. You were fighting for certain basic rights. One of the things that I sense might be changing is, for the first time, I'm hearing from predominantly white communities an openness to talk about reparations. I don't ever remember, in all of the conversations I've had with largely white audiences and white churches, any real openness to that. But I'm hearing it now for the first time. And you are a member of a Hawaii conference that was a part of an act of reparation on the part of this denomination for the work that they did in literally destroying what was a legitimate government there in Hawaii, and then altering the culture as it moved forward from that point forward. What are your observations about that moment, and what can it teach us as we begin to open up a very new conversation and a very different conversation about reparations?
Well, I think probably, speaking of the reparations, what the Hawaii Conference did those many years ago was to dig deep into its portfolio and give back to all the Hawaiian churches that existed at the time of the overthrow. We gave them funds to help them. Mm-hmm. And I think what we probably didn't say enough of is that we need to undergird this reparation with love. And I think that's really where the church is, that we need to love the neighbors, we need to love ourselves, and we need to love the earth. And I think what has gone wrong is that I read on the internet the other day that someone said that we are living in ignorance, we're doing dangerous and mindless and heartless things. And I think that what we need to do is to heal each other and ourselves, that there's so much hurt in the world that when we talk of reparations, we need to really offer them in love.
That's beautiful. I had a mentor who once taught me that reparations is about repairing damage, and only a part of that is financial, that there's damage to our psyche, to our soul, to our spirit, to our bodies. And I think you're right. Love has to be a component of. And if we just throw money at this and the money is offered with resentment and reluctance, then no damage has been repaired. And in fact, the worst damage has not been repaired. Just a couple more questions, Elly. You have long supported as a donor the work of the wider church. And in this conversation, you've talked about your history with and love of the denomination. What is it about the United Church of Christ, especially whether we're talking about the global pandemic or these commitments to racial justice? What is it about the United Church of Christ that makes you such a loyal donor and devoted member and follower of this way of being church?
Well, I think it has to do with the way the United Church of Christ is set up.
Okay.
And the local church being the primary focus of the church.
Yeah.
And I think that what we need to do is we need to really impress on people that our congregational roots mean that we have a duty to participate. And it goes in every setting of the church, but in the local church, whether it be in the association or the conference or the national church, our job is to really participate and have, to be able to learn more and to be able to do more. If we don't participate, then I think we sort of
You are so right. And I come out of a Catholic world. That's where I grew up. And the contrast just between the role of the laity in that world and in this world, you are so right. The responsibility of the laity to define the faith for their generation. You are also a board member of this United Church of Christ. What does that mean to you, and what do you think is one of your biggest responsibilities as a board member right now?
Well, I think there are probably many aspects. One is that I think as a board member, we need to be diligent about learning what's going on.
Yep.
I think we need to be able to interpret that to the other settings of the church. I feel I've not done enough to interpret what we're doing in the national church to the local church. And, that's my shortcoming. And I think we really need to do a lot more of that, is to do what we would call mission interpretation, to really tell the story and in all of its frailties and its good points, but to tell the story. If we can do that, I think we'll have gotten very far.
Well, I'm gonna hold you to that promise to tell the story and to deepen the connection between the local church and the wider church. Before we go, just a quick memory, and then I'm going to let you have a last word with our viewers, as I do with all of our guests. The last time I was in Hawaii, you and your husband treated me to this wonderful dinner. And I remember two things about that evening. One, when we came to the restaurant, I thought, this just doesn't look like a really special place. But when we got in, it was wonderful and probably the best meal I've ever had in the islands in Hawaii. But the second thing I remember is this dessert that came out, which was a piece of art. And I remember taking a picture of it, which I never do. I never take pictures of food, and thinking, I can't eat this. It's beautiful. But what a lovely evening that was. And I want to thank you for that. And I'm going to give you the last word. What would you like to share with our viewers before we go, Elly?
Well, I just think, to reiterate what I said previously, I think our job is to remain vigilant, that we're called to do no less in these times. Even if we feel like we're overwhelmed, I think we need to be diligent, and that we must undergird everything that we do with love, because until we can love our neighbors and ourselves and the earth, I think we'll have fallen short.
I can't think of a better way to end the conversation. Elly, thank you. And I want to thank our viewers for tuning in again. We'll see you again next week on Conversations with Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you.